I'm going to ask you to turn to John chapter 11. We have been doing this sermon series here in Lent called Why Are You Crying? The reality of human sorrow. And we said from the outset that we weren't as concerned with why does human suffering exist, although that is a very important question. And it's a question that people ask all the time, but it wasn't a question that necessarily we were going to try to answer in this series. We've answered it in other studies and at other times. But we said what we wanted to focus more on is what is the behavior of God when we are sorrowing, or when we are struggling, or when we are suffering. And so, the first week we talked about crying over abandonment. And we studied the story of Hagar. And the fact that she was out in the desert by herself with her son and feeling abandoned and misused and abused. And then the second Sunday we talked over the crying of desperation, over that thin sliver of hope that is there as Bartimaeus cries out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And so if the first week was about crying over abandonment, and if the second week was about crying over desperation, then today is about crying out over hopelessness, or depression, or a feeling that all really has been lost. We've said from the get-go now that there are different reasons that we find ourselves calling out to God. There are different experiences that bring sadness and sorrow to us as human beings. And sometimes it is that we've gotten blindsided by something that we don't expect from someone that we thought we could trust. Sometimes it is a lifelong situation that we've been dealing with, and we're just hoping that maybe, somehow, God will work on our behalf. Today we're talking about that thing that comes, in this case, rather unexpectedly, that completely wipes out any hope that we had. Now you might sit here this morning and say, okay, but as Christians, aren't we supposed to be people of hope? And that is true. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But if we take any sort of a temperature of human experience, we know that everyone goes through moments in life where our hope is at least challenged, if not sometimes seems to disappear. What are things that drive us to hopelessness? What are things that drive us to depression? First of all, we have to recognize that depression is actually a somewhat of a chemical response of the body. And so sometimes it isn't a significant or a certain situation that has caused us to feel that way. Sometimes it really is an effect of the body or of the mind and the chemicals that are in it. And so we have things that we label depression in different categories: seasonal depression, situational depression, clinical depression, just to kind of help us understand that they come from different areas. Today we're going to focus more on this cry of the heart from Mary and Martha that seems to be more of a situational depression. Their brother has just died. If you've been around me at all in funeral settings, you've probably heard me say this, but I never encourage people to shy away from the feeling of sadness when something sad happens. You should feel the way that you feel when something sad happens. In fact, if you didn't feel sad or depressed or frustrated or overwhelmed when something sad happens, we might question whether or not you had really processed it, that it had really hit you. Have you ever been in a situation, maybe you go to a funeral or maybe you go to a hospital situation, and you come away and you've talked to a family member or somebody who should be way more upset than they seem to be, and you come away, and what do we usually say? It hasn't hit them yet. Because why? Because we know when it hits them, this is not the behavior that we will probably see. And that's the way we were created. We weren't supposed to deal with the sorrow that comes from human brokenness and sin and death which has entered into the world. Our bodies were created to be in an eternal relationship with God. That's what we were made for. And so when you put in sorrow into the equation, our bodies struggle to react to that, to know what to do with it. Certainly we find these two sisters in that situation in John chapter 11 today. I'm not going to read the whole story for you, but you know, and I've preached on this text before, but you know that Jesus was actually made aware ahead of time that things were not going well for Lazarus. And Lazarus is Jesus' friend. And so as you can imagine, Jesus having this close friend named Lazarus who is sick and on the verge of death, you know what Jesus' immediate response would be, don't you? Except he didn't. If you got a phone call today from one of your closest friends or family members and something in crisis had happened and they were very ill or something had happened in them, you would probably drop everything that you were doing in order to go be with them, wouldn't you? Or you would at least want to be. You would say, "Do you need me to come?" Jesus, the Son of God, who actually knew that Lazarus was going to go ahead and die, does nothing. And then sure enough, Lazarus passes away, and the word comes to Jesus, he's dead. And Jesus says, well, he has fallen asleep, so I'm going to go so I can wake him up. And at this point, I think maybe the disciples in huddled conversation behind Jesus' back maybe said, it hasn't hit him yet. You don't go wake somebody up who has died. He's not sleeping, Jesus. So Jesus then says to them plainly in verse 14, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. There are sometimes, Jesus is the guy that you want to have at your funeral, right? I mean, because Jesus never met a funeral that he could, stand to sit through the whole thing. Always had to be raising people from the dead. So Jesus is the guy you want at your funeral. You're thinking, all right, Jesus can take care of this problem. And Jesus says to the disciples, I'm glad I wasn't there to heal Lazarus. And you got to think the disciples are kind of going, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you had been there, you could have healed him. We wouldn't have to be going through this. And so when Jesus actually does show up on the scene, he travels to that area and he's there. And Martha says to Jesus, Lord, same thing. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha also said to him, I know that he's going to rise again on the last day, but for right now he's dead. And Jesus says something very interesting to Martha. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Isn't it interesting that Martha's looking down the road at some day when Jesus will raise Lazarus again in the end days? And Jesus is saying to Martha, the resurrection is not down there, it's right here. I am the resurrection and the life. And everyone who believes in me will never die. Well, now, Martha's probably confused. What do you mean never die? He just died. He's buried. What do you mean will never die? The point that Jesus is trying to get through in all of this is that something else is happening here that you don't see on the surface. Well, then you know that Mary finds out that Jesus is in the area, and she goes. And she came to Jesus, she saw him and fell at his feet. Basically saying the same thing. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now here is where I want to focus your attention this morning. When Mary came and she fell at his feet, in verse 33 of chapter 11 of John's Gospel, John, who is standing there watching the whole thing unfold. And remember that Lazarus was probably a good friend of John and some of the disciples too, because they were hanging out with Jesus. Jesus' close with this family. John's watching this whole thing unfold, and here is what he records. Here's what he remembers. Because he didn't write this down right away. This is sometime later that he's writing all this down. Here's what John remembers in verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her, in other words, her friends who had come with her, who were also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. When Jesus saw her weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit, and he was troubled. Think about that for a second. This is Jesus, the Son of God, who knows what is about to transpire. He knows that he has the ability to walk up to that tomb and say, Lazarus, come on out. He knows that. He knows that death is no match for him. He knows that the whole narrative is about to change. And yet, when he sees Mary crying, he is moved in his spirit. The words from that text in the original language actually mean that he had a deep internal groaning. And that in his spirit he felt unbalanced or disturbed. Listen to me, my friends. There are not many places in Scripture where it is recorded that the God of the universe was disturbed by something. He creates the entirety of the universe by speaking it into existence. No problem. He lays out the plan for the redemption of man before the foundation of the world. So it is known that when Adam and Eve sinned and he says, this is what that plan is going to look like, he does not stumble over it. In the Old Testament stories of Noah and Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and David and Solomon and Isaiah and Jeremiah, we see God being saddened. We see him being frustrated. We see him responding to the disobedience sometimes of his people. We see his blessings. We see his miracles. All throughout the New Testament we do. But in very few places do we hear God was disturbed. He was shaken. What is it that has transpired that causes the Son of God to be so internally disturbed, to have this deep internal groaning in his spirit? What is it? We may say, well, it's that his friend had died. But I don't think that is it. In fact, in verse 35, when it says Jesus wept, that was always our favorite verse in the Bible as kids, right? Your parents would tell you, you need to learn more scripture verses. You need to memorize more scripture. So you say, well, I got one. John 11:35, Jesus wept. There was never a good place to whip that out, though, when you were trying to witness to your friends. You always had that verse in your memory, but you could never really use it for anything. But even in verse 35, when it says Jesus wept, it says this. Some of them, when they see how Jesus responds, they say, now wait a minute. Couldn't this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept him from dying? And Jesus again is deeply moved within. He came to the tomb, and then we'll pick up the story. You know that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. But I want you to notice that as much as I think Jesus was affected by the death of Lazarus, again, he's deeply moved when he goes to the tomb. I believe that what disturbed the heart of the Son of God in that moment was that he saw Mary cry. Again, as much as Jesus is probably bothered by the death of his friend, he knows where this story's headed. What is it that rattles Jesus' cage in this moment? It's that Mary is crying. You may or may not know this about me. I'm not much of a crier myself. My emotional elevator doesn't go up or down very far. It's the way God made me. Sometimes I wish it was different. But I am far more likely to be moved to emotion by watching someone that I care about being moved to emotion. I can remember being at my grandmother's funeral, having very little emotional response. It was just, I was sad, but like I didn't feel that, like kick in the stomach. Until I saw my father crying. And that shocked me. Okay? Jesus does not seem, not that he's not affected by the death of Lazarus, but what seems to really get to him is that Mary is crying. Why am I bringing this up this morning? Because Mary is in a place, Martha and Mary are in a place of feeling like hope is lost. Whatever little bit of hope there is hope way down the road someday in the resurrection. Whatever hope they have, they're going to have to wait for. And so, in this moment of depression, in this moment of depressiveness, of feeling like hope has been lost, they pour out their hearts in pain. They cry out to their friend, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. And when they do, he himself groans within his spirit, is disturbed by this reality, and he himself weeps. Listen to me, my friends. When you cry, God weeps. God is not some vague, foggy, misty reality sitting in the heavens just existing. God is the creator of everything that you are. He made you in your being. He knows everything about you. He did not make you to have to deal with sorrow, but he knows that you have to deal with sorrow. And when you cry out, he feels it. In our first message, we talked about God coming to the woman who had been abandoned and saying, there's more to the story. Last week, we talked about him bringing that hope that Bartimaeus had been looking for and saying, I've got a solution to your problem. But today, we are talking about before the solution and before the big picture, God feels the pain that you are experiencing. We do not pray to a God who is oblivious to the reality of hurt. For God the Father himself lost his son to death. He knows what you are feeling. He understands your pain. He knows what sorrow is. And when Mary cries, Jesus feels it. Now Jesus goes to the tomb. he himself weeping. At least according to John's account, Jesus started crying before they ever got to the tomb. Again, I think an indicator that he is being more moved by Mary and Martha's feelings. But they get to the tomb, and Jesus stands in front of the tomb and he says, "Roll away the stone." Now, I cannot help but imagine that as Jesus is standing here, think about this with me, and he is on the outside of a tomb that is covered with a stone, with the dead person on the inside, that he is not, in his divine understanding of events, is not somehow looking down the road a little bit to when he knows that he has been called to be on the other side of that stone. See, there's going to come a day where Jesus is the one who has died, and he's the one that's been laid in the tomb, and he's the one that has the stone that is now covering the doorway. And so he says to move it. Jesus says to his Father, "I'm thankful that you have heard me, and that you always hear me, but because there are these here who may not believe or understand, so that they may believe." But in his humanity, I also wonder if Jesus is considering just this strange connection between what is about to happen, or what he's about to ask his Father to do, and what his Father is going to have to do again when Jesus himself is laying in the tomb. I'm not saying that Jesus doubts the Father, or that Jesus doubted the process or what was going to happen. But in his humanity, I at least wonder if Jesus is not standing there going, "This is how it has to work. Because if the dead guy can't come out of the tomb, then what I am here for doesn't happen." And so he says, again, very much a foreshadowing of resurrection morning, "Roll the stone away." And then he calls into the darkness, "Lazarus, come out." And you have heard me say this before, probably, in teaching maybe on this text or other texts like it. But when the dead guy comes out of the tomb, the funeral is over. There's no more funeral to be had here. There's no more sorrowing to be had. Jesus does two very significant things in this moment. He feels the pain of Mary and Martha, and he calls into their darkness and brings out a new reality. But hear me, even if he had not raised Lazarus from the dead, he still would have felt their sorrow. He feels your sorrow. He may or may not bring out of your darkness the thing that you're hoping he will bring. Mary and Martha had their brother return to them. He may or may not exactly give you what you are hoping for, but that does not change the fact that he feels your sorrow. You are not alone. If Jesus had come ahead of time, remember he said, "I'm waiting so that you may believe." If he had not come ahead of time, they never would have seen the resurrection. He could have healed Lazarus, and they would have said, "Oh, thank you, Jesus, for healing him." But there would have not been a resurrection, and the resurrection was way more impressive than the healing. But there's another point. If he had not waited, we also never would have gotten this glimpse into Jesus and his sorrow. The scriptures tell us that he is a man of sorrows. He's acquainted with your grief. Surely he himself knows how to bear our iniquities and our pain and our brokenness. Isn't it encouraging that when you're sad or depressed or overwhelmed, isn't it encouraging to know that the God of the universe is familiar with your sorrow? You don't have to explain it to him. Because when you cry, he feels it. He knows it. Now, at various points in life and different experiences, we all go through these points of sorrow, of sadness, of hopelessness. You may be in one now, you may not be in one now, but I want to offer you this. God is not oblivious to your sorrow. He's fully aware, and he is going to get glory to himself in the end. All he's asking you in that moment is to be faithful to him. We're going to conclude this morning by singing this really familiar hymn that talks about the reality of sorrow. And what I want you to notice about this hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," is that it never suggests that the pain and the difficulty that we deal with should not be taken seriously. It simply says, when good things are happening, when peace is there, or when sorrows roll over me like waves on the ocean, whatever it is that I'm dealing with, I'm not going to ignore it. I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't exist. I'm simply going to say, it is still well with my soul. Why is it well with my soul? Because the Creator understands. And he is bigger than our sorrow, even in the midst of it. So let's stand together as we respond to what we have heard from the Word of God and sing this hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul."